In this video, we are going to talk about section 5.5 and 6.4, which is about inverse trig functions. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about sine. So we look at this graph of sine, and we test if it is a function. We do that by using the horizontal line test. So if I do the horizontal line test, I notice that no, it is not a function. So because it's not a function, we need to restrict the domain in order to make the inverse a function. So I'm going to restrict the domain from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So we're going to restrict it from here to here. And a couple of things to note that we can write sine inverse as sine to the negative 1 or arc sine. Those both mean inverse sine, so they mean the same thing. So when I look at the graph of the inverse here, I can see that my domain goes from negative 1 to 1, and my range is going to go from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So we're going to be using quadrants 1 and 4, but instead of using the quadrant 4 numbers that are in the normal unit circle, we're going to go from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. And so what that's going to look like is quadrant 1 is pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3. And now my quadrant 4 is going to be negative pi over 6, negative pi over 4, negative pi over 3, and negative pi over 2. So what we're doing here is we're basically doing the opposite of what we did with the unit circle. So if I gave you, back when we started unit circle, the sine of pi over 3, and I said, well, what's the sine of pi over 3? We would go to pi over 3, and we would look at that coordinate, and we know that sine is our y coordinate, so I would say that the sine at pi over 3 is root 3 over 2. Now I'm going to give you what is the sine inverse root 3 over 2, and you need to give me that the inverse sine at root 3 over 2 is pi over 3. And so we're just going the opposite direction. So if I do this first example, sine inverse of root 2 over 2, well, this would be pi over 4. Arc sine, again, is the same as the sine inverse, so sine inverse of negative a half, well, that's going to be down here, because this coordinate would be root 3 over 2, negative 1/2. So this is going to be negative pi over 6. And then this guy is something we would type in our calculator, and so make sure your calculator is in radian mode. And when you type that in your calculator, you would get 0.452. Similar to sine, cosine, if I draw a horizontal line test, it is also not a function, so we also are going to restrict the domain. And so we're going to go actually 0 to pi for cosine, because I need two quadrants right next to each other that have positive and negative. Again, when we use the inverse cosine, we can write it as cosine negative 1 or arc cosine. Those mean the same thing. So let's take a look at the inverse cosine graph. So I can see that my domain is going from negative 1 to 1. Went a little farther. And my range is going from 0 to pi. And so what this will look like on the unit circle is I'll be using quadrants 1 and 2, so going 0 to pi. And so my solutions can be anywhere between 0 and pi. So if the cosine inverse of 1/2 is where is the cosine 1/2? The cosine is 1/2 at pi over 3. Our cosine, again, cosine inverse, where is it? Negative root 3 over 2. Well, that happens at 5 pi over 6. And then again, this is when we would type in our calculator. Make sure you're in radian mode. And I would get 0.127. Tangent also does not pass the horizontal line test, so it's also not a function. So again, we're going to restrict it. This time, though, we need to restrict it based on the asymptotes. So I'm going to restrict it between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. But this time, I'm going to use round brackets because tangent is undefined. at negative pi over 2 and at pi over 2. So again, tangent inverse or arctangent means the same thing. So if we look at this graph, I can see that my domain is going to be negative infinity to infinity, and my range is going to be negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So it's going to look really similar to the sine half circles. We're going to go from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So we have quadrant 1, and then the same values in quadrant 4, just negative. So arctan, tan inverse, where is it? Root 3 over 3. Well, that means that my y is 1/2 and my x, or negative 1/2, and my x is root 3 over 2. And this happens at negative pi over 6. Whereas tan inverse negative 1, well, that is where my two values are the same, which is going to be at negative pi over 4. And then again, this one we're going to type in our calculator, and I'm going to get negative 1.169. All right, so let's put this together with composition now. So with compositions, we always want to work from the inside out. So I'm going to do sine inverse of root 2 over 2. Well, sine inverse of root 2 over 2 is pi over 4. And so the tangent at pi over 4 would be 1. I want to find where the tangent is negative root 3. Well, that happens at negative pi over 3. And so the cosine at negative pi over 3 is going to be positive 1/2. Here, my cosine at 5 pi over 4. Well, cosine at 5 pi over 4 is negative root 2 over 2, which for the inverse cosine would be at 3 pi over 4. The tangent at 3 pi over 4, the sine inverse of that would be negative 1, and the sine is negative 1 at negative pi over 2. Sine at 3 pi over 4 is root 2 over 2, positive root 2 over 2, which happens at pi over 4 for sine inverse. Cosine at negative 1 is pi. The sine at pi is 0. So go ahead and pause the video now and try this practice section. Play the video when you are ready to check it. All right, so tangent inverse is root 3 at pi over 3. Sine inverse is negative 1 at negative pi over 2. Cosine inverse is negative root 2 over 2 at 3 pi over 4. Arc sine again, inverse sine is 1/2 at pi over 6. Tangent is negative 1 at negative pi over 4. Arc cosine is 1/2 at pi over 3. And then we have this section of compositions. So sine inverse of sine of pi over 2 is 0, so the answer is just pi over 2. Cosine inverse of root 2 over 2 is just pi over 4. Arc tangent of root 3 happens at pi over 3. Tangent at pi over 3 is root 3. Arc sine, which is just sine inverse. Sine of 3 pi over 4 is root 2 over 2, which would just be pi over 4. Tangent inverse, cosine at pi over 2 is 0. Tangent of 0 is 0. Cosine is negative 1 at pi. Cosine of pi is negative 1. Tangent of 3 pi over 4 is negative 1. Sine is negative 1 at negative pi over 2. Sine at 3 pi or 5 pi over 3 is negative root 3 over 2. And the cosine inverse of that would be 5 pi over 6.